We had this great discussion during the adult forum today, led by Dave Reed, about what it means to have our core values as Christians inform our decisions about how we care for the land. And we had this great dialogue about how we care for the soil and what crops we plant and how we treat each other as neighbors. And it was a fantastic discussion. The thing that Dave kept stressing is that in order to address any of these environmental problems, we have to go to a deeper level. It's a spiritual issue. That we have to look at who we are as God's people and who we understand ourselves to be in terms of what the Bible teaches us, what we learn from the church teachings, and how that informs who we are and how we treat each other. So, looking at what Jesus said and did is very important, and how that informs our environmental theology, so to speak. One time I was asked, does Jesus really say anything about the environment in the Bible? I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything about that. And so I was doing a Bible study at my previous congregation, Reformation and Media, and one of my parishioners asked me this. Well, how often does Jesus talk about this? And I knew it was quite a few, but when I actually read through the Gospels, I found that actually Jesus references nature over 50 times in the Gospels. Oh, that really shocked me. And then, not just Jesus, but just other references that the Gospel writers wrote that mention nature, another over 50 times that nature is referenced. So just in the Gospels alone, nature is referenced over 100 times. I thought that was pretty amazing. So it's undeniable that both Jesus and the Gospel writers saw creation as integral to giving witness to God's kingdom and revealing to us who Jesus was. So, for example, Jesus was present at the beginning of creation. We see that in John. He speaks about the earth as integral to the inbreaking of God's kingdom. He interacts with rivers and lakes and seas and winds. He goes to the wilderness to pray. He goes to a garden to pray. He goes onto mountains. And he uses lots of images from nature to illustrate what he's talking about. He talks about the birds of the air and the flowers of the field and fig trees. He talks about all elements of nature. At the same time, nature witnesses to who Jesus is. Remember, he said that the stones would cry out if the people were made to stop singing about him on Palm Sunday. And they were present at the crucifixion. The earth itself shook when Jesus was crucified. And the first witnesses of the resurrection were certainly the flies that thought they were going to buzz around the dead body, but found he was alive. So it's nature itself that gave witness to creation. And then we have this passage today in Matthew. It says, "He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings about justice to victory." This is just one example of how Jesus' ministry is not just for humans, but in fact is for all of creation. Because this is actually quoting from Jesus' favorite prophet. Who was Jesus' favorite prophet? Anybody know? Isaiah. Isaiah was his favorite. He quotes Isaiah more often than any other prophet. So it's worth looking at the original passage from Isaiah to see, well, where does this come from? So take out your bulletin and look at this first reading that we had from Isaiah. So you can see, well, what is Jesus talking about? Why is Jesus referencing Isaiah for his teaching? Now, as you're turning to that, and it's on page 4, just a little bit of historical context to Isaiah's book. This ancient passage that you heard today was actually written 800 years before Jesus was even born. So this passage is over 3,000 years old. That's some ancient wisdom right there. The other thing to remember is that this was written at a time when Israel was at war with other neighboring countries, and they were attacked and they were taken to Babylonia as slaves. Their temple was destroyed, and they're really doubting whether God loves them and cares for them. And they know that part of the reason why they're in the situation that they're in is because they have broken a lot of the commandments that God has given to them. And it seems that the covenant, the contract that God has made, is null and void because human beings have violated the contract. So they're in deep distress about their relationship with God. It seems that the line of David is lost, the temple is lost, everything that they had, who they are as a people, is lost. So it is into this echoing cavern of self-doubt and communal devastation that Isaiah is writing this prophecy. He's proclaiming a new covenant for the people of Israel. And according to Isaiah, this covenant is coming through a new leader. In Hebrew, the word is Ebed, which means a servant or ambassador or a prophet, or it can even mean friend. Now, this is very good news because it means that while Israel did break the covenant, the relationship with God has not been destroyed. Now, this is good news for us as well because, if you think back on times in your life when you messed up or you made decisions that seemed to violate who you really were, and you let someone down or you let yourself down and you felt like you left God down, it can be very easy to get sucked into this pit of despair, or to feel like you don't want to just get up and brush yourself off and start all over again. It feels like sometimes you just want to give up. But this word in Isaiah is for the people not to give up. God is essentially saying, I'm not throwing in the towel on you. I'm not giving up on you. I'm sending someone to you who will handle you with love and care and tenderness. He will be gentle with you. He will not extinguish your dimly burning wick. And not just you, but your entire group. He's going to bring justice to those who are imprisoned. And he's going to ensure that those who have been trampled are restored. So look at verse 1 here. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I put my spirit, ruach, that's the breath of God, upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. So this servant, we don't know who it is at this point. We don't have a name, but we know what the servant is to look like, what the servant is supposed to do. So we know that God is choosing the servant, and that God is delighting in this servant. We know that the servant will be humble. He's not going to lift up his voice. Another word to say it is, he's not going to be a blowhard. No, he's not going to be like a typical politician who just talks and talks and talks and is very blustery. Not going to be that kind of leader. And then in verse 3 it says, a bruised reed he will not break, a dimly burning wick he will not quench. This tells us that the servant will not harm those who are vulnerable or hurting. So we know that this person is like no other servant leader that God has previously lifted up. And even more significantly, the servant is being installed within the context of creation. It says, I have put my spirit upon him. That ruach is the same spirit that we hear about in Genesis chapter 1, when the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. It's the same thing. So this servant has the same status as the very beginning establishment of the earth. And it also says that the servant will be a teacher. The coastlands wait for his teaching. So that means that all of the ecosystems of the earth, the coastlands, the mountains, the glaciers, the tundra, the oceans, are all waiting to learn from this servant leader. So that means that we are to learn how to handle creation with the same care that the servant leader handles the people, by not doing further damage, by refraining from doing anything that would extinguish the dimly burning life of creation. Now in verse 6, as you'll see, it says, I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. That means that God is speaking right to the servant in this part of the text. I have taken you by the hand and I have kept you, it says. So that means that God is actually accompanying the servant. God is going to be there alongside the servant. Sort of like a parent with a child. Then it says, I have given you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations. So God is not just making this promise to the servant, but also for all people, for all the nations of the earth. And the servant has specific tasks. The servant is to open the eyes of the blind, bring out the prisoners from the dungeons, from all those who sit in darkness. Now, as Christians, when we read this, we can't help but bring Jesus to mind, right? Jesus is doing all of these things. Especially as we look at Jesus' installation service as the minister of the people on the Jordan River when he is baptized. God speaks from heaven, remember, and says, this is my servant, this is my child with whom I am well pleased. There's that taking delight in Jesus. And then Jesus takes on the mantle of the servant himself. As he is baptized, he is claiming God's righteousness for himself. And he's assuming the rights and responsibilities and the duties that a servant leader entails. He protects those most vulnerable. He protects children. Remember, he says, let the children come to me. He protects women. He says, let them learn from me. I'm going to heal them. He opens the eyes of the blind. He frees many from the dungeons of illness and poverty. He confronts the Roman and Jewish authorities. He confronts hypocrisy, speaks truth to power, and he teaches on the coastlands and in the mountains and on boats and in houses and anywhere his followers are gathered. And you know what Jesus called God? What was Jesus' name for God? Anybody remember? Abba. And that means daddy. Jesus called God daddy. So there's that parent-child relationship. And then all the nations benefit from Jesus' ministry. Because it's not just meant for the Jewish people. It's meant for the Gentiles, for the non-Jewish people. It's meant for all people as well. So Jesus' ministry starts among the Jews, but it's intended as peace for all people. The message of Jesus transcends all the lines that we draw in the sand, all the lines based on gender and race and economics and your tribe and your people. It doesn't matter. Jesus is there for everyone. It shines on all people. And more than that, it's also for the earth itself. It's more than just for people. It's for the other than human people of earth. This is for the bruised reeds of nature. It's for the species facing extinction. It's for the air, the ruach, choking with pollution. It's for the mountains that are being sawn off for coal and minerals. It's for the habitats of wildlife that are trying to find a place to live and eat and raise their young, but instead there's a strip mall or there's a fracking pad or there's another development. So Jesus' inauguration there on the Jordan River is placed within creation when humanity is at peace. Then the earth, which supports humanity, can be at peace as well. That's the message. Now, I long for the fulfilling of this covenant. And I get so discouraged sometimes when I see the way humans have reneged on the contract with God about creation. I see the bad decisions that we have made. I see our selfishness. I see how bad we've messed up our home. I see that we've let each other down. we've let ourselves down, and we've let down God and God's creation. And sometimes I get sucked into the pit of despair when I think about the future of our planet in terms of the species dying and climate change and all of the devastation. It's very easy to give up hope. I was just presenting at Gettysburg Seminary, and I heard someone say, I don't really see any hope. We've done so much damage. We've passed the tipping point. Where is there hope? And it was very important to realize that the message of Jesus applies today, just as it did for Jesus' people, just as it did in Isaiah's time. And that message is, do not give up. Just because the covenant has been violated, the relationship still exists. God is still working. God is going to work with us through the servant leader to help heal the bruised reed of creation. And if you look at Jesus' ministry and model yourselves on what Jesus did, then you will take care not to further damage those who are hurting. He will lead you in gentleness so that you will follow his example and have mercy on the least of these, the babies in their mother's womb, the children whose bodies are so sensitive to the toxins we put into the world, to the poor who are dealing with the effects of environmental degradation more than those of us who are cushioned by our wealth, and down to the very last species that are breathing their last breath on this earth. We are bringing about justice to the earth when we follow Jesus' example of this servant leadership. You yourselves can be a servant leader. You can be a light to the world. And that means, just like Jesus, you are part of the new covenant. You are actually God's gift to the world. You know, people sometimes joke about that. Oh, he thinks he's God's gift to the world. No, the church really is God's gift to the world. That's what Faye was trying to say, that people of faith have something. We have these spiritual values. We have these core theological, moral, and ethical values that when we sow them into the soil, so to speak, that affects everything. It's drawn up through the roots, right into the lives of our community, of our land, of our trees, of our very lives. And this symbol of new life is the cross. The cross is where the death and resurrection, where that pivot point happens, where the covenant was broken, but God was still present and transformed it into something life-giving, something powerful, something that has an effect on all of creation, right down to you and me. God is declaring this new creation around us. And I am so encouraged to see new developments in technology for how we provide clean water and plenty of food for everyone. Thinking about how to minimize our impact on the earth. Thinking about, as I was saying in the children's sermon, how much we waste and how we can learn to be content with what we have. And how to make choices so we think about not just ourselves, but the seventh generation, as our Native American brothers and sisters have taught. Our eyes are being opened. And I believe that the church can lead the way to help God release the earth from the dungeons of darkness and despair. I want to conclude with a prayer by Brother Roger, who led the Taizé community in France. Some of you may remember this prayer because we said it every time we had a midweek Lenten service, and it was always the prayer that ended the service. Listen to this prayer. O Christ, you take upon yourself all that weighs us down, so that freed of all that holds us back, at every moment we can begin anew to advance from worry towards confident trust. from the shadows towards clear running water, from our own will to the vision of the kingdom of God. And in this way, though we hardly dared hope it, you enable every human being to be a reflection of your face. Amen. That is what being a follower of the servant leader Jesus is all about. Becoming the face of Jesus to your neighbor, to your family, to your community, in your workplace, and to the very earth itself. May God strengthen you with the heart and faith and hands and feet to be the promise of the resurrection that is emerging within us and within all the earth. Amen.